It's 1985. Cupertino, California. A 30-year-old man stands in a silent parking lot, watching the sun set over the empire he built with a soldering iron and a dream. Just hours ago, he was the king of Silicon Valley. Now, he is a ghost. The security guards have been given a new set of orders. Steve Jobs is no longer allowed inside. The locks were changed. The vision was confiscated. This wasn't just a corporate reshuffling, it was a public execution of a man's identity. But the world didn't know that this wasn't his ending. It was a rehearsal. Because 10 years later, he would return, not just for his job, but for the throne. This is the story of the man who lost everything, only to realize that being fired was the greatest gift he ever received. To understand the fall, you have to understand the ego. Steve Jobs didn't just want to build computers, he wanted to build artifacts. He was obsessed with the curve of a case, the font on a screen, even the way the circuit boards were laid out, parts that no customer would ever see. But by 1984, that obsession had turned toxic. He was impossible. He berated engineers until they cried. He created the reality distortion field, a psychological bubble where he convinced people the impossible was easy, and the logical was irrelevant. He had recruited John Scully, the CEO of Pepsi, with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" It was the perfect recruitment. And it was Steve's biggest mistake. Scully was a man of spreadsheets. Jobs was a man of dreams. When the Macintosh launched in 1984, it was a masterpiece, but it was an expensive one. Sales began to crater. The board of directors looked at the numbers and then they looked at Steve. They saw a loose cannon. A liability. In a climactic board meeting, the sugar water salesman turned on his mentor. The board voted. Jobs was out. He was 30 years old, a household name, and he had just been humiliated on the world stage. He retreated to a back building the staff called Siberia. He sat in an empty room with a single desk. No phone calls. No meetings. No future. Most people with $100 million in the bank would have bought an island and disappeared. But for Steve, the money was never the point. The point was the work. In a fit of rage and liberation, he sold all but one share of Apple stock. That one share was his ticket to the annual meetings, a way to keep an eye on the people who betrayed him. Then, he did something crazy. He started over. He founded Next. He wanted to build the most powerful workstation the world had ever seen. But he didn't stop there. He bought a tiny, struggling graphics division from George Lucas for $5 million. He renamed it Pixar. For the next 10 years, Steve Jobs was in the wilderness. He was losing millions of his own dollars every year. Next was too expensive to sell. Pixar was a hardware company that no one understood. He survives on 4 hours of sleep and pure, unadulterated spite. These were the failed years. But secretly, they were the most important years of his life. At Pixar, he learned how to manage creative geniuses without crushing them. At Next, he built the operating system that would eventually become the foundation of every Mac we use today. He was sharpening his blade in the dark. And while he was getting stronger, Apple was dying. By 1996, Apple was a disaster. They were 90 days away from total bankruptcy. They were making printers, scanners, and clones of their own machines. They had lost their soul. In a move of ultimate desperation, Apple's new CEO, Gil Amelio, decided to buy Next for $429 million. The prodigal son was coming home. But he wasn't coming home as a friend. Jobs walked back onto the campus as an informal advisor. Within weeks, he had convinced the board that Amelio was incompetent. He staged a silent, bloodless coup. By July 1997, Jobs was the interim CEO. The first thing he did? He called his greatest rival, Bill Gates. Microsoft invested $150 million to save Apple. The fans hissed and booed. They thought Steve had sold out. But Steve knew something they didn't. To save the future, he had to bury the past. He walked into the product room and looked at a whiteboard filled with dozens of projects. He took a marker, drew a simple 2x2 grid, and said, "Here's what we are making. 4 products. Everything else? Kill it." He fired 3,000 people. He ended the clones. He focused on one thing, excellence. In 1997, the Think Different campaign launched. It didn't mention computers. It mentioned the misfits. The rebels. The troublemakers. Steve Jobs was all 3. The man who had been fired for being too difficult used that exact difficulty to create the iMac, the iPod, and eventually, the iPhone. He turned a dying computer company into the most valuable entity on the face of the earth. Shortly before he passed, Steve reflected on that day in 1985 when he was kicked out of Apple. He said, "The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it." The lesson for us is simple. Sometimes, life is going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. Your greatest failure isn't a wall. It's a door. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are usually the ones who do.